My brother raised his glass at his promotion. My sister's still unemployed. Some people peak in high school. Everyone laughed. His boss stood up. Actually, she just bought the company. We've been investigating your expense accounts for months. Security was already at the door. The room was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft murmur of congratulatory voices as my brother stood at the center of it all. This was supposed to be his night, the culmination of years of hard work, of relentless effort. His promotion had finally come through, and the celebration at the office was a testament to his success. But I couldn't shake the sense of unease that hung over me like a dark cloud, no matter how bright the room seemed. As the party buzzed with excitement, I found myself standing quietly in the background, away from the spotlight. Everyone was gathered around my brother, congratulating him on his latest achievement. His colleagues clapped him on the back, offering praise and admiration. Meanwhile, I stood there, the glass of champagne in my hand growing heavier by the minute. The laughter around me felt distant, as though it were happening in another world, not the one I was currently stuck in. I watched my brother with an intensity that surprised even me. He was everything I was not. Confident, charismatic, the man everyone looked up to. His smile was effortless, his words carefully chosen, and his charm magnetic. It was as if the entire room existed solely for him. Yet as I watched him soak in all the attention, I couldn't help but feel a deep, unspoken tension simmering beneath the surface. For the first time in years, I was no longer content with my role in the background. The party was supposed to be a celebration for him, a joyous occasion, but instead, I felt the invisible gap between us growing wider by the second. The more people fawned over him, the more I felt like an outsider in my own family. It wasn't just jealousy, it was something deeper, something that had been building for years, and tonight it was finally bubbling to the surface. I had never felt fully seen by my family. For as long as I could remember, my brother had been the golden child, the one who excelled at everything he did. He was always the one whose accomplishments were praised, whose every step was met with admiration. Meanwhile, I was the one who faded into the background. No one ever noticed when I succeeded. No one ever celebrated my achievements in the same way they did his. I was always second to him, always the afterthought. I thought I had accepted this dynamic, had grown used to it over the years. But tonight something shifted within me. The hurt I had buried for so long began to rise, slowly at first, then with increasing force. My brother's success, his smugness, it all seemed to mock me. And his words, the ones he casually threw out to entertain his guests, cut deeper than I could have anticipated. Then, just as I was trying to push those thoughts aside, I heard him raise his voice, making his announcement to the room. "I have to say," he said, holding up his glass, "my sister's still unemployed. Some people peak in high school, right?" He grinned, the playful tone in his voice ringing with mockery. The room erupted into laughter, everyone in stitches at his clever little jab. The sting of his words hit me like a sharp slap, and for a moment I was frozen. The laughter around me seemed to echo in my ears, drowning out everything else. I could feel my pulse quicken, my chest tightening. His joke was meant to be light-hearted, a way to entertain the crowd, but for me it was just another reminder of how little I mattered in his eyes. I forced a smile even as the taste of bitterness filled my mouth. I laughed along with everyone else, of course. It was the only thing I could do. The alternative was to make a scene, and that was the last thing I wanted in front of so many people. But behind the forced smile, a wave of resentment swept over me. How many times had I been the butt of his jokes? How many times had I been pushed aside for his sake? Tonight, the weight of all those years of being invisible felt unbearable. I stood there, nodding along as people around me chuckled, offering their own comments in agreement with my brother. "Yeah, high school was the peak for some of us," one of his colleagues added, trying to keep the joke going. The laughter continued, louder now, as if my brother's words were some kind of witty remark to be celebrated. And in that moment I felt more alone than I had in years. I didn't want to be the person who hated him. I didn't want to resent him for his success, but the truth was, it was hard not to. It wasn't just his words tonight. It was the entire history of our relationship, the years of being compared to him, of being judged by a standard I could never meet. He was the success story, the one everyone admired, and I was the afterthought. The one who never quite lived up to the expectations. And yet I had my own story. My own achievements. But they had never been good enough in the eyes of others, and certainly not in my brother's eyes. I had worked hard, struggled to carve out a place for myself in this world. But somehow no one had ever taken notice. Tonight, my brother's careless jab was a sharp reminder that I would always be second to him. As the night dragged on, I tried to focus on the conversations around me. But the words felt hollow, the smiles forced. I excused myself from a conversation about work, finding an empty corner where I could gather my thoughts. The soft hum of the party was still audible in the background, but in that moment I felt completely isolated. I was a spectator in my own life, watching as my brother continued to steal the spotlight, while I stood in his shadow, silently drowning in my own feelings of inadequacy. I glanced across the room at him again. He was still surrounded by people, still basking in the attention, laughing and enjoying the admiration of everyone in the room. But something inside me stirred. A quiet, yet undeniable anger simmered beneath the surface. For the first time, I didn't feel like just a passive observer in his success. I felt a burning desire to change that. To take control, to level the playing field. The resentment I had carried for years, years of being overshadowed by him, was finally bubbling over. I had always been the quiet one, the one who stepped back and let him take center stage. But that was about to change. Tonight I realized something crucial. I didn't have to stay in his shadow. I didn't have to accept the role I had been given. As I stood there watching him, I knew I had a choice. I could either let this resentment fester, continue to be the invisible sibling, or I could do something about it. The moment had arrived. The opportunity one had waited for was finally within reach. But that wasn't all. There was something more, a secret I had been holding on to for months. A secret that, once revealed, would shatter everything. My brother's reckless spending, his unchecked lifestyle at the company, it hadn't gone unnoticed. In fact, I had quietly gathered evidence over the past year, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And tonight, as I stood there with my heart pounding and my mind racing, I realized that moment had arrived. My brother had no idea what was coming. This wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't about hurting him in return for the years of insults and belittling. This was about reclaiming my place in the world, about proving to everyone, including myself, that I was more than just the overlooked sibling. That I could stand on my own. That I could be the one who had the last laugh. I wasn't just the quiet, invisible one anymore. I wasn't just the failure. I was ready to make my mark. The game was about to change, and this time, it wasn't going to be my brother who held all the cards. This expanded version adds depth to the characters' emotions and internal conflict, while keeping the focus on the tension between the protagonist and their brother. It deepens the resentment felt throughout the years and sets the stage for a dramatic shift. The room, once filled with laughter, now felt like a pressure cooker. As the noise of the party began to subside, the shift in atmosphere was almost palpable. There was a sudden hush, a sense of unease hanging in the air, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath our feet. People turned toward the front of the room, curious, their eyes narrowing in anticipation. And then his boss stood up. For a moment no one knew what to expect. My brother's triumphant grin faded as the boss cleared their throat, signaling the beginning of something no one had seen coming. "Actually," the boss began, their voice cutting through the quiet like a knife, "she just bought the company." A gasp swept through the crowd. It was as if time itself had frozen. My brother's smirk faltered, and in that single moment I saw him lose control, something I had never witnessed before. His posture stiffened, his eyes wide with disbelief. I watched as the room seemed to shift its focus from him, the center of attention, to me, the one who had quietly been sitting in the background. My heart raced, pounding in my chest as the truth I had carefully concealed for months finally came to light. I had spent the last year carefully monitoring my brother's reckless spending, his extravagant and unaccountable lifestyle, all while he continued to rise higher and higher in the company, barely noticing the damage he was causing. His constant need for approval, the bribes, the luxurious dinners on the company's dime, everything had been documented, gathered, and tucked away like a secret I was planning to use. But in this moment everything changed. The revelation that I was now the owner of the very company my brother had poured his life into sent shockwaves through the room. There was no turning back now. The boss continued, their voice steady but resolute. "Over the past few months, we've been investigating your expense accounts. The company has been quietly watching, documenting every misstep, every misuse of funds. And tonight we've come to the decision to act." Each word landed like a hammer, each sentence drawing the noose tighter around my brother's neck. The people who had once adored him, his colleagues who had looked to him for guidance and leadership, now seemed to pull back, their faces a mixture of confusion, shock, and growing discomfort. I felt a strange sense of detachment. For so long I had been invisible, ignored, and undermined. But now, in front of everyone, the tables were turning. I was no longer the dismissed sibling, the one who could never live up to expectations. No, now I was the one in control. I had played my hand and it was a winning one. But as much as a part of me wanted to bask in the satisfaction of his downfall, another part of me hesitated. This wasn't the celebration I had imagined. It wasn't about joy or victory. It was about something deeper, something much more personal. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from me, about making the world see that I was more than the overlooked sibling. But the cost was high. The sound of footsteps suddenly echoed through the room, sharp and quick. The tension escalated. A few seconds later, the door opened and 2 security officers stepped inside. I had known this moment would come, but it still sent a chill down my spine to see them walking toward my brother. The room grew eerily quiet. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats and I could see their nervous glances, some avoiding eye contact altogether. My brother's face had drained of color, his smugness now replaced with panic. He took a hesitant step back as if hoping that maybe, just maybe, the reality of the situation wasn't truly happening. "Mr. Lawson," one of the officers said, his voice gruff. "We'll need you to come with us." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. For a moment no one moved. My brother's eyes darted around the room, his fingers trembling at his side. He was trapped. I could see the panic in his gaze, the same panic I had so often felt as I stood silently on the sidelines of his life, watching him get everything he wanted while I got nothing. Then the tension snapped. He didn't protest. Instead, he stumbled toward the officers, the weight of the moment too much to bear. His colleagues watched, some with pity, others with disbelief. I didn't know what I expected, but certainly not this. My brother, the golden child, being escorted out of the room like a criminal. As they moved toward the door, the room remained still, frozen in the aftermath of the revelation. His boss stood by, watching it all unfold, not with satisfaction but with a sense of finality. This was the end of the line for my brother. The damage had been done and there was no way to undo it. But for me, the feeling wasn't one of victory. It wasn't the sweet satisfaction I had imagined. Instead, it was a deep, unsettling sense of unease. Watching him being led away, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and disbelief, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within me too. This wasn't just about him, it was about me. I had fought for so long to prove myself, to make others see that I was capable, that I was more than just the failure in the family. And now I had done it. But at what cost? I glanced around the room, seeing the faces of my brother's colleagues, all of them whispering in hushed tones, exchanging glances. They had always seen him as the star, the one they admired and looked up to. But now they were watching him unravel before their eyes, and I could see the unease on their faces. The admiration had turned to something else entirely. Embarrassment, pity, maybe even fear. For the first time I felt the weight of my revenge, and it was heavier than I expected. As much as I had longed for this moment, a part of me regretted it. What had I really gained by bringing him down? His downfall didn't feel like justice. It felt like an empty victory. I watched him, now a shell of the man he once was, as the security officers led him out the door. His colleagues, once eager to celebrate his success, now stood silent, unsure of what to say, where to look. The room felt too small, too stifling. The clinking of glasses, the cheers, the laughter, all of it seemed like a distant memory, a world that no longer existed. As my brother disappeared through the door, I felt the room settle into an uncomfortable quiet. Everyone was waiting for something. For what, I wasn't sure. But for me, the moment had passed. The power I had longed for had come at a price, and now all that was left was the silence. The hollowness of what I had just done. The reality of what had just unfolded settled in my chest, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was worth it. Had I really proven myself? Or had I just become the very thing I had despised for so long? There was no easy answer. But one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the event passed in a haze, each one blurring into the next. The news about my brother's downfall had spread like wildfire. Social media, ever hungry for the next sensational story, had latched onto the scandal with a fervor I hadn't anticipated. Headlines screamed about the investigation into his financial mismanagement, the dramatic exposure of his secrets, and the scandalous revelation of how his reckless actions had finally caught up with him. I could hear whispers everywhere I went, at work, in the grocery store, even on the street. It was as if his disgrace had become the town's new entertainment. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had their say. But as the world talked about him, something strange happened within me. The victory I had longed for, the sweet satisfaction of watching him fall, didn't feel as fulfilling as I thought it would. The weight of his public shaming, the constant headlines and gossip, hung over me like a thick fog. This wasn't how I had imagined it. I had expected to feel liberated, vindicated, like I had finally achieved the justice I deserved. But instead, there was only an unsettling emptiness, an ache deep inside that I couldn't quite explain. The guilt began to creep in slowly at first. How had I gone from being the quiet observer, the invisible one, to this? Was this really the way to make things right? The victory I had imagined was nothing more than a hollow shell. The public shaming of my brother hadn't solved anything for me. If anything, it had left a void, a space where I thought triumph would live. I wanted justice, yes, but now I wasn't sure what that even looked like anymore. Back at home, the atmosphere was tense. My brother's reaction had been one of pure, unfiltered rage. He had stormed into our parents' house that morning after the announcement, his face twisted in anger. He was barely recognizable in the way he spat venom at me, accusing me of ruining him, of making sure he never saw the light of day again. "You always were the bitter one," he had sneered, his eyes blazing with fury. "You couldn't stand to see me succeed. You couldn't stand that I was better than you." His words struck harder than I had expected. They felt like a slap across the face, crueler and more venomous than any joke or mocking comment he had made before. For a moment, I stood frozen in the doorway, his accusation hanging in the air. Was it true? Had I been motivated by bitterness all along? Had my need for justice, my desire to bring him down, come from a place of envy and spite? I hadn't wanted to be the villain in this story. I had just wanted what was right. But now his words made me question everything. Was I just another petty sibling angry at the success of a brother who had everything? Or had I done something justifiable, something that would finally make people see my worth? The truth felt blurry, slipping through my fingers as I tried to grasp it. The anger in his eyes had mirrored the anger I felt inside. But now I found myself asking if his hatred for me had any merit. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the victim. I felt like the aggressor. And in that moment, the victory felt all the more bittersweet. My actions had torn apart something that, despite everything, I still had some semblance of a connection to: my family. The tension at home only deepened after that. My parents, torn between their loyalty to their son and their desire to support me, could barely hide their discomfort. They didn't know how to handle this rift between us, and I couldn't blame them. I didn't know how to handle it either. My mother had cried when she saw my brother's face on the news, devastated by the fact that her son, the one she had always cherished, was being humiliated in front of the world. My father, on the other hand, had retreated into silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on him too heavily for him to articulate anything. Even my extended family wasn't sure where to stand. Some whispered that I had done the right thing, that my brother had it coming for years. Others, though, sided with him, believing that family matters should have stayed private. "You should have handled this differently," my uncle said one night over dinner, his voice heavy with disapproval. "You could have talked to him, worked it out. Publicly embarrassing him like this, it doesn't feel right." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had thought that everyone would understand, would finally see that what I did wasn't just personal. It was a matter of integrity. But now even my family seemed fractured, torn between their love for him and their understanding of my actions. The support I had anticipated, the justification I thought I'd find in their eyes, was fleeting. What had seemed like a righteous cause now felt like a war that had destroyed more than it had fixed. I spent the next few days alone, my thoughts swirling, the loneliness pressing in like a heavy weight. At work, the attention on me shifted. While my brother's disgrace continued to dominate the news, I quietly became a figure of respect among my colleagues. They didn't see me as the bitter sibling anymore. They saw me as someone who had made the tough call, someone who had stood up for what was right. But the respect felt empty too. I didn't want this kind of attention. I didn't want to be admired for making my brother's downfall public. I wanted fairness, yes, but this was not what I had envisioned. The isolation that followed the event was heavier than I could have imagined. I thought that by exposing my brother's flaws I would feel empowered. Instead, I found myself retreating further into myself, feeling more disconnected than I had in years. The victories I had dreamed of, the justice, the validation, the peace, seemed so far out of reach now. Late at night, when everything was quiet, I would sit by myself, staring at the walls, reflecting on the choices I had made. The questions that had once seemed so clear now felt impossibly complicated. Was this really justice? Or had I become the very thing I had despised? Had my need for justice overpowered my need for peace? I didn't have the answers, and in that silence, I realized how much I had lost in the process. I had wanted to change the narrative of my life, to stop being the background character in my brother's story. But in doing so, I had written a new narrative, one where the cost of revenge was more than I could bear. The toll on my family, the division it had caused, was a price I hadn't fully understood until now. My relationship with my brother was forever fractured, and my relationship with my parents was no longer simple. And yet I couldn't help but feel a shift in myself too. As the dust began to settle, the anger that had once fueled me began to fade. What was left was an undeniable truth. Revenge had never been the solution. It was a bitter, hollow feeling, one that I couldn't escape. Justice wasn't found in bringing someone down. It was found in rising above. The cost of my actions had been steep, and while I had gotten what I thought I wanted, I couldn't ignore the truth that now lay before me. I had taken my shot. But the aftermath? That was something I wasn't prepared for.